Okie doke. About that time. Well, good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well this evening. This is Psych 598E. Evo. Stab it. Evolutionary psychology. Hooray. It was harder than I thought it would be. The final chapter. Hooray. This is the last time we have to do these lectures online. So thank you for being patient with this. I'm really sorry we had to do it this way, particularly these last three lectures. I think we would have had a great discussions if we'd had class. So I'm so disappointed about that, but we're finally made it through, and I'm disappointed we didn't have more class time. I'm sure you are too, but we just did the best that we could. A lot of you have been writing to me about your papers. People have a lot of good ideas and things, so the papers are due like Friday of finals week. Okay, Friday next week. I got to have a little time to grade them. I want to give you enough time, and then you can just send an email to me at Cooper at iastate.edu and just attach your paper. So I do need a little bit of time to grade it. Okay, so our last lecture here, we have some readings on objections to evolutionary psych, but I wanted to bring up some of the objections I often hear. So first part of our lecture is going to be on common objections to evolutionary psychology. Common objections to evolutionary psychology. And then I'll talk about each of them and try and give what the evolutionary psychology response would be. So, objection number one that I often hear, evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychologists claim that human behavior is entirely genetically determined with no influence from the environment. Evolutionary psychologists claim that human behavior is entirely genetically determined with no influence from the environment. The guy I associate with this objection, I've heard it from other people as well, is P.Z. Myers. He runs a biology website called Ferangela, I think is the name of it. He's a biology professor at some little college, but he hates evolutionary psych. And I think he said one time, I know, his main objection is, well, they think every single thing humans do is an adaptation. All right, well, this is a classic example of straw manning. No sane person would make the claim that there's no influence from the environment. And in almost all these theories that we've talked about, we're talking about contingent mechanisms in people, modules that are only set off when the right circumstances are here. So nobody could seriously argue that what language you speak is not a product of your environment or your culture. Nobody could seriously argue your ability to drive a car or ride a bicycle or read or any of the things that humans can do that they couldn't possibly due to evolved modules in the EEA. So this is a crazy objection. This is attempted a straw man. So I would say here's the, I'm going to use EP as an abbreviation for evolutionary psych. So EP response is no evolutionary psychologist claims culture and the environment do not affect behavior. Most of the genetic mechanisms posited by evolutionary the V is a terrible key. Evolutionary psychology are contingent mechanisms, meaning they are only activated by the appropriate stimuli from the environment. Okay. No evolutionary psychologist claims culture and the environment do not affect behavior. Most of the genetic mechanisms posited by evolutionary psychology are contingent mechanisms, meaning they're only activated by the appropriate stimuli from the environment. All right, so let's take, I'm going to take a non-psychology example to start with to show how evolution can provide a mechanism in your body that only works when the appropriate environmental stimuli are present. And so calluses would be a good example of this. There's a mechanism in your body for producing calluses when there's constant friction on a part of your body. And so if you're hammering all day without gloves and do that for several days, well, you're going to form calluses on your hands. Now, if you want to avoid that, well, what you have to do is you have to reduce the friction, and that will keep that callus mechanism from kicking in. So if you wear gloves, for example, while you're hammering, then the callus mechanism won't kick in. Well, that's going to be true of a lot of the things we talked about, the evolutionary psych theories we talked about in class. So one of them was the culture of honor, right? That people are really, really responsive to insults when they're in situations where their assets are easy to steal. And so the idea is that if any of us were in that situation, the situation like a herder in the ancestral environment would be in, or like a modern day drug dealer, well, we've got that module up in our head that makes us super, super sensitive to being insulted when we're in the situation that our assets are easy for people to steal and we don't want to appear soft. And so there's an example of the environment causing a particular module to kick in that case. Okay, so nobody would seriously argue this, and you know you're straw manning if they say something like this. All right, so now let's go with objection number 2. If some aspect of human psychology has an evolutionary basis, then we can't change it. If some aspect of human psychology has an evolutionary basis, then we can't change it. Okay, well, when I was going to teach my undergraduate evolutionary psychology class, that has to be approved by the undergraduate program committee, has to be approved by the faculty, has to be approved by an LAS committee, and then eventually a university committee. But I remember there was a considerable debate within the department when I proposed this. There's some people in the department definitely did not want me teaching evolutionary psych. And one of the arguments that was made in that faculty meeting is, well, I think we, in psychology, we should be concentrating on the things we can change, not the things we can't change. Well, I don't know about that. First, to start with, you can't. I teach sensation and perception, too. There's really not much you can do to change that at this point. So this would pretty much take large swathes of psychology. Pretty much all of cognitive psychology, I think, would be taken out of consideration if psychology can only study things that we can change and not anything that we can't change. So on the face of it, it's a little silly. But I think you can change your behavior if you understand how the module works. I get similar arguments, things like, we talked about how men value attractiveness in their mate more than women do, and women value the economic prospects of their mate more than men do. And now I get this objection, well, I know some women who care about attractiveness more than they do about money, so evolutionary psych is wrong. Well, okay. What I would say is that you can change things if you know the appropriate inputs, and I'll get to some examples in a second here. Similar thing to this is the concept of instinct. And instincts have a particular meaning in ethology, the study of animal behavior. It's the sort of behavior that occurs in the presence of a particular stimulus and can't be shut off. That's what an instinct is. And so there's the stickleback fish is a good example of an animal with an instinct. There's a red spot on the belly of a male stickleback fish. When one male stickleback fish sees that red spot on the belly of another, it immediately attacks it. And immediately attacks it even if it would be dangerous to him to do so. Like if he had to go through a bunch of some kind of thorn bush that could rip his flesh, he will still do it. He just can't shut it off. When he sees that little red spot, zoom, he'll just go to it. And you can even get him to do that to any kind of red spot. You can just put a red spot on a popsicle stick, and the stickleback fish will attack that, and he can't shut it off. Well, that's the idea I think some people have about what evolutionary psych is saying, is that it's saying we have these instincts like the stickleback fish. And there was this kid who was taking a psychology class at Ames High, and his teacher would tell him things. He would come to my office hours. I used to have office hours on Thursday evenings, and he came to like 3 of my office hours in a row wanting to discuss things his teacher had been telling him in his class. And so she asked the class, this teacher of the psychology class at Ames High, asked the class, do humans have any instincts? And they said, well, instinct to sleep, instinct to eat, instinct to have sex, instinct to drink. And then the teacher cuts off all debate by saying, oh, humans have no instincts. Well, okay, in a technical sense, yes, we do not have instincts the way the stickleback fish does, in the sense that we can always shut off our behavior, and even if it would be dangerous to us to engage in a particular behavior, we're able to do that. Well, they aren't. But what I think the teacher wanted people to think, and what she thinks, is that there's no like biological inputs whatsoever to our behavior, and that isn't right. Even if we don't have instincts in the technical sense, a lot of the things we talked about clearly are biological influences on our behavior. So here's like the EP response to Objection 2. The response. When planning a course of action, both evolutionary and environmental I'm having a lot of trouble. Environmental considerations will be taken into account. By understanding how the evolutionary influences on our behavior operate, we can find the best environment. The V key is going to kill me here. Environmental stimuli to alter people's behavior. EP response: when planning a course of action, both evolutionary and environmental considerations will be taken into account. By understanding how the evolutionary influences on our behavior operate, we can find the best environmental stimuli to alter people's behavior. So again, going back to the callus mechanism, we know that you wear gloves, you won't form calluses. So understanding the evolutionary process and what environmental inputs it takes, that leads us to be able to come up with the glove-wearing solution to the callus development problem. Similarly, if we know that men tend to lower their threshold for inferring women's sexual intent, we can tell men that, look, you have this bias where you think women are interested in having sex with you when they really aren't, and then they can correct for that. So that's an example of that. If we know the inputs that go into deciding when to use violence, then if we can reduce those inputs, we can reduce violence. So I think this is, again, I don't quite understand it. It does not seem like real objection to evolutionary psych per se, merely by saying that the things that are posited by evolutionary psych can't be changed, and, well, of course, that they can be changed. In the case of, say, the woman who values attractiveness in a mate more than she values his financial prospects, well, I think there is some input for valuing financial prospects for her, and that is an evolutionary input, and then maybe she has more of a cultural input for valuing men's attractiveness. But in general, for most women, the input for valuing resources is going to be stronger than the one for valuing attractiveness. There might be, for whatever reason, through strong environmental inputs or what have you, some women in which that's reversed, but in general, for women, one of the processes is going to be stronger than the other. That's all we're saying. So, important point here to make about this whole issue. Some behaviors may be more amenable to environmental influence than others. But just because a behavior has some evolutionary basis in no way implies that it cannot be changed. Okay, so of course you have biological inputs that make you hungry and sleepy and thirsty, and the critics are right. Those are going to be very hard to change. I don't think we're going to change environmentally how hungry, sleepy, or thirsty somebody is. But I do think we can maybe change their propensity to engage in violence. I do think we could get men to realize that they are inferring sexual intent on the part of women when the women aren't really interested. So I think it's a valid research program to find out which aspects, which modules are easily modified or can be shut off easily, and which ones can't. But that doesn't imply that if there's any biological input that it simply can't be changed. Some of them might be like that, but others clearly are not. All right, objection number 3. Evolutionary psychology requires improbable computational abilities on the part of animals. Evolutionary psychology requires improbable computational abilities on the part of animals. All right, so if you remember Hamilton's rule of inclusive fitness, and that said that altruism will occur if C less than R times B. So natural selection favors altruism when the cost of the giver is less than the genetic relatedness between the giver and recipient times the benefit to the recipient, right? And so R is 0.5. If you share half your genes with the person, like your brothers, your sisters, your mother, your daughter or son, and 0.25 if it's your uncle or niece or nephew or grandparent or grandfather, okay? So remember, this is Hamilton's rule. Now, there was a psychologist, Morton Salins, wrote a book, The Use and Abuse of Biology, which was written primarily in opposition to evolutionary psychology. Here's what he says about Hamilton's rule. Hunters and gatherers do not have counting systems beyond 1, 2, and 3. I refrain from comment on the even greater problem of how animals are supposed to figure out that R, the genetic relationship between the animal and its first cousins, equals 1/8. The failure of evolutionary psychologists to address this problem introduces considerable mysticism into their theories. Okay, so animals can't be using Hamilton's rule because they don't understand fractions. Okay, I heard a similar argument with woodpeckers. So there was a study these biologists did, and what they did was They wanted to determine what the optimal number of holes a woodpecker should drill in a tree before it decides that it's a bad tree and it should move on to another tree. So woodpeckers drill holes in trees to look for bugs in the trees. And it turns out some trees are good trees that have a lot of bugs, and other trees are bad trees that don't have many bugs. And so on any one hole, even if it's on a good tree, you probably won't get any bugs if you're a woodpecker. And so the question is, how many holes should the woodpecker drill before the woodpecker decides this is a bad tree and I should move on? Now, if you only drill one hole and then move on, well, you're probably flying around too much, right? Because even on a good tree, one hole is probably not going to reveal any of the bugs. And so you probably shouldn't just try one hole and then move on. But on the other hand, if you're going to try like 100 holes, well, then you're probably spending too much time on that tree and too much energy doing the holes. There's a certain number of holes where you have to say, hey, I think this is a bad tree, and then move on. And so the biologist tried to figure out, taking all the variables in account that might influence this decision, what the best number of holes to drill in a tree is before the woodpecker moves on. And you can imagine all the stuff you have to take into account. So you have to know like the weight of the bird and how many calories it expends going as it flies. You have to know the distribution of the bugs on the trees. So, you know, how many good trees there are and how many bad trees there are, what percentage of each. You have to know how likely it is that any one hole drilled on a good tree will find bugs, and any one hole drilled on a bad tree will find bugs. And you got to take into all this stuff into account that would influence how far the bird has to fly and how many calories it has to expend to fly from one tree to another, which would include the wind speed and the average weight of the birds and the average distance apart from the trees, and on and on and on. And so the purpose of this article these biologists wrote was to impress upon you just how many variables are required for somebody to know in order to determine the optimal number of holes the woodpecker should peck in the tree before moving on. And after all these calculations, they found that it was 6 holes. It's best to do 6 holes. If you haven't found any bugs after 6 holes, then the woodpecker should move on. And in fact, when they recorded the woodpecker's behavior, that's what they did. They would peck 6 holes. If they didn't find any bugs, they'd move on. Now, I tell this to my brother and my sister-in-law, and they, neither one of whom managed to make it through college. And they just think evolutionary psych is just the stupidest thing they've ever heard. They just think it's so silly. They can't believe that we're crazy enough to believe this stuff. And so when I tell my brother about the woodpecker picking 6 holes, he said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So you're saying like the woodpecker figured out all these variables and then came to the conclusion, yep, I should do 6 holes before I move on. Okay, well, no, I don't think that's what's going on in the woodpecker's mind at all. So here's our EP response to the idea that animals aren't smart enough to use Hamilton's rule. We need mathematics to describe the adaptations that animals are using, but the mechanism the animals are using to make decisions does not require that they perform the same mathematical calculations. EP response, we need mathematics to describe the adaptations that animals are using, but the mechanism the animals are using to make decisions does not require that they perform the same mathematical calculations. So nobody thinks that humans know Hamilton's rule, and when they're deciding whether to help a relative, they try to make a guess about the costs, and they try to make a guess about the benefits, and they put an R in appropriate to whatever relative they're helping, and then do the computation. Nobody is saying that. What we're saying is that animals whose behavior was close to Hamilton's rule, that is, they gave help in instances where they would pass on more genes if they gave help, and they didn't give help in circumstances where they'd pass on more genes if they didn't give help, that animals that did that would pass on more genes. So the closer that an animal approximates Hamilton's rule in its behavior, the more genes it's going to pass on, and it's through that process that all animals start acting as though they're behaving Hamilton's rule. But the likely mechanism that's going on in the animal's mind is probably something like, well, maybe the more an animal looks like me, so your near relatives are going to look most like you, the more help I should give them. Or the more time I spent with this animal in my childhood, and you'd expect that to be the case for your near relatives, the more help I'm willing to give this person. And then the strength, presumably, of how much help you're willing to give, how much love you have for them, well, that was determined by a psychological module that evolved through natural selection. Okay, similarly, the woodpeckers, I don't know, they're not saying that the woodpeckers are computing all these variables that you have to compute to know how many holes to peck in the tree. What they're saying is that once upon a time, there were probably some woodpeckers that pecked 4 holes, and then they kind of felt bored and would move on to another tree. Some that picked 5 holes before they got bored and moved on. Some that picked 6 holes before they got bored and moved on. Some that picked 7, some that picked 8, and some that picked 9. And over time, year after year after year, because 6 was the optimal number to peck before you moved on, well, the genes for the woodpeckers that would make 6 holes before they changed trees, they had more offspring because they survived longer than the ones that would peck 5 times or 8 times or 3 times. And so eventually all the birds in the population will peck 6 times before they move on. But at no point in the process was any bird actually computing all the variables they needed to know to determine that 6 holes is the optimal number of holes. And that's the wonderful thing about evolution. Evolution can produce what looks like intelligent behavior through a non-intelligent process of just the animals that are doing the right thing leave more genes than the animals that aren't, and then in the end, all the animals are left with the genes for doing the right thing. All right, objection number 4, and this may be the most common one I hear. Objection number 4, one cannot generate theories based on what life was like in the EEA because we cannot know what the EEA was actually like. One cannot generate theories based on what life was like in the EEA. Remember, the EEA is the environment of evolutionary adaptation. It's the period in Central Africa from about 1.5 million years ago to about 200,000 years ago when the human brain was evolving. And yeah, nobody living today was living in the EEA, and so we don't know exactly how those people did live. And so that's why we can't come up with theories based on how they live. Well, that's kind of like saying, well, you know, all astronomy theories are wrong because nobody was around at the time of the Big Bang, so we can't really know what the universe was like. Well, okay, I wish, and I've never seen this from anybody who's made this objection, I wish they would give an example of, look, here is this evolutionary psych theory that is making these ridiculous assumptions about how people lived in the EEA, and so we know that it's wrong because certainly we can't know that people really lived that way. Well, the EP response to this is, there is good evidence. There's good evidence that people during the EEA lived in small groups of about 150. that were nomads who hunted and gathered in Central Africa. Beyond that, evolutionary psychology makes very few assumptions about what the EEA was like. Further, if a particular evolutionary psychology theory is making incorrect assumptions about what life was like in the EEA, then presumably its predictions will fail to come out when tested. Okay, objection 4. One cannot generate theories about what life was like in the EEA because we can't know what life in the EEA was actually like. EP responds, there's good evidence that people during the EEA lived in small groups of about 150 that were nomads who hunted and gathered in Central Africa. Beyond that, evolutionary psychology makes very few assumptions about what the EEA was like. Further, if a particular evolutionary psychology theory is making incorrect assumptions about what life was like in the EEA, then presumably its predictions will fail to come out when tested. Okay, so I wish they would, like I said, give an example of a theory that makes crazy assumptions about what life was like in the EEA, but they never do. The only maybe questionable assumption is we are, in some theories, and we didn't talk about these really, but some theories do assume that men hunted in the EEA and women gathered. There is evidence for that. That's the division of labor in all the current hunter-gatherer societies, but of course can't know for sure if that was really true in the EEA or not. But that's the beautiful thing about science. So this objection kind of only holds if once you've come up with a theory, you just decide that the theory is right without collecting any data to test it. And if you're just doing that, well, that's not really science anymore, right? The idea is if you're making incorrect assumptions about your theory, not just an evolutionary psych, but really any theory in science, well, when you use the theory to generate predictions, well, then the predictions will not come out because your theory is based on incorrect assumptions. So presumably science would be self-correcting on this issue. So I think this one is kind of not a very intellectually honest one. You actually have to come up with some theory that makes ridiculous assumptions about the EEA in order to for this one to be valid. Okay, objection number 5. Evolutionary psychology is not real science because it cannot be falsified. Okay, so the idea is that falsification is the hallmark of science, right? That's what distinguishes a scientific theory from non-scientific theory. And so since evolutionary psychology can't be falsified, well, then it's not science. That was another objection I got when I wanted to teach my undergraduate class when we were debating it at the department level. Evolutionary psychology cannot be falsified, and so it belongs in the philosophy department, not a department of science. Well, I don't know. If you're going to take that, I mean, I guess what they're saying is we can't really go back in a EEA in a time machine and record gene frequencies changing. That's true. But if you're going to say that, you have to say that, well, we can't go back in time to the Big Bang and see what actually happened. So astronomy is not science because it can't be falsified. Geology would be out of bounds. Evolutionary biology generally, all of these things would be out of bounds if we adopted that criterion. Well, EP response to this is EP response. Although it is true that the general proposition that evolution has influenced behavior cannot be falsified. Specific evolutionary theories about how a mechanism works can be falsified. Although it is true that the general proposition that evolution has influenced behavior cannot be falsified, specific evolutionary theories about how a mechanism works can be falsified. So evolutionary psychology is not a theory. Evolutionary psychology is a way of generating theories. So yeah, it's true evolutionary psychology can't be falsified. That is true, because there's no way to prove that evolution didn't influence people's behavior. But once you use that theory, that idea, to generate a theory, well, now that theory can be falsified. Whenever I presented a theory in here, I always talked about the evidence for the theory. The theory is of no value if there isn't some evidence for it. And so what that means is, yeah, the theories we talked about are capable of being falsified. So let's take Scheherazade theory. Scheherazade theory says language developed. It was a sexually selected characteristic that people use to impress mates. And if something is a sexually selected characteristic, that makes the prediction that men should be influenced by this characteristic more than women should. Men should have evolved to display the characteristic, and women should have evolved to appreciate the characteristic. And so what I would say was, yeah, we've got evidence that men behave differently in their speech when they're around other men as opposed to in a mixed sex group. If that weren't the case, I think that would falsify Scheherazade theory. Men have bigger vocabularies, as we talked about, and are more likely to write books, which suggests that they have evolved to display the behavior. Women have better verbal abilities generally, better verbal comprehension skills, and are more likely to purchase books, and that makes sense. Females have evolved to appreciate the male's display. If those things weren't true, I would have to say, well, the Scheherazade theory is wrong. Remember, we talked about how there was an old theory that language evolved for the purpose of hunting, but that's largely been falsified, as hunters usually don't use language to hunt. Animals like chimpanzees hunt very much like humans and are able to coordinate their hunting without language, and so I would say the language evolved for the purpose of hunting theory has been falsified. So yeah, it's possible to falsify evolutionary psych theories. What strikes me throughout for many of these objections is the people positing them seem to think all evolutionary psychology is you come up with these stories out of your brain about how something could have evolved, and then you just believe the stories without actually looking for any evidence. And that's, again, a straw-mannish characterization of what evolutionary psychology is, I would say. All right, objection number 6. Evolutionary psychology is just a bunch of made-up just-so stories with no evidence to back them up. Evolutionary psychology is a bunch of made-up just-so stories with no evidence to back them up. Okay, well, if you ever hear somebody saying evolutionary psychology is a just-so story, you know they aren't thinking for themselves. That's a sort of thing that's endlessly repeated. The just-so stories were a set of stories by Rudyard Kipling about how animals acquire different characteristics. They are completely fictional stories. And although I like Rudyard Kipling, I like a lot of the stuff he's done, the just-so stories I think are awful. I just think they're horrible. So there's one like how the leopard got his spots, how the camel got its humps. Let me try and recall the how the camel got its humps stories to illustrate to you how bad these stories are. One day all the animals were out working except the camel. And the camel, when he was asked to do his work, he just kept saying harumph. And they asked him the next day to do his work, and he said again harumph. So the other animals got a genie to come, and they told the genie about the camel who refused to do any work and always said harumph when he was asked to do work. And so the genie says, all right, because the camel always says harumph when he's asked to do work, I will give him humps, which sort of sounds like harumph. And while the other animals are resting, the camel will not get to rest because the other animals did the work while he was slacking off. So now the camel has to work out in the hot sun while the other animals get to rest. Okay, so that's how the camel got its humps. Yeah, I told you it was stupid. What, harumph? And so he put humps on? So it's pretty dumb. Anyway, getting back to this. Yes, okay, I would say EP responds. This is a fair criticism of some evolutionary psychology theories. That is, sometimes people come up with theories where, no, there isn't a lot of evidence for them, and no, they might not be falsifiable. I think I mentioned before I had I'm not going to call it a theory, not very useful idea, that perhaps humans like music better than they like visual art because we evolved from a creature that used music as a lacking display or singing as a lacking display. And so certainly humans could vocalize a long time before they had speech. Lucia sent me some information about this guy who hums as part of his singing, and he thinks that has kind of a primal reaction on people, and that maybe that could be that during the period between when we broke off from chimpanzees to when we started speech, it would have been a period about 4 or 5 million years, we were singing or humming without actually being verbal. But that's, there's no evidence for what I just said. There's no evidence. That's why we like music best, and I can't even come up with evidence to falsify it. So no, that idea that we evolved from a creature that used a mating call certainly does not deserve the status of like Scheherazade theory or Machiavellian intelligence theory or gossip is grooming theory that we've talked about that I believe are falsifiable theories. And I know, like Steve Pinker talks about in, I believe, The Blank Slate, he has this thing about, well, why is the penthouse more expensive than the bottom floor? Well, he says, because in the EEA, there will be lots of survival advantages to being at the top of like a hill, to being as high as possible. Because you'll be protected from wild animals, you'll be able to see them, you'll have an advantage if someone attacks you because you'll be like throwing your spears and things downhill, so you'll have gravity working for you while the people attacking you will work against you. So that's probably why we've evolved to prefer to live in tall places or high places. Well, now, somebody could make just the same argument. Let's say it were the case that apartments on the lower floors were more expensive. I could make a similar evolutionary argument. Well, that makes perfect evolutionary sense. Because in the EEA, you wouldn't want to live too high up. That would mean you'd have to drag like water and food and expend all these calories dragging stuff up to the top of a hill. So, of course, you'd want to live near the bottom of the hill. That's why apartments at the bottom are more expensive than ones at the top. So, yes, you could use evolutionary thinking to prove both A and not A. That is true, but, that's how theories start. All theories start as just so stories, and then what you got to do is use the theory to generate some predictions and collect data to see if the predictions come out or not. That's just the way that science works. And so, no, there isn't just like one evolutionary explanation for a particular phenomenon. You can maybe make up multiple ones, But the idea then is that you find a difference in the predictions that the different theories make, and then collect data to see which one makes the correct prediction. So EP responds as fair criticism of some evolutionary psychology theories. However, there are many evolutionary psychology theories that have a great deal of evidence to back them up. All theories start as made up stories, and the purpose of collecting data is to decide whether there is any truth to the stories or not. This is a fair criticism of some evolutionary psychology theories. However, there are many evolutionary psychology theories that have a great deal of evidence to back them up, like Scheherazade theory. All theories start as made-up stories, and the purpose of collecting data is to decide whether there's any truth to the stories or not. So it's not unique to evolutionary psychology to come up with stories for which there's no data at present. Well, that was, that's why we collect data. So everything starts that way, not just evolutionary psychology. Throughout this, it seems like the critics think that when an evolutionary psychologist comes up with a possible evolutionary theory, they then just immediately accept that theory as being the right explanation and don't collect any data, don't try to test the theory at all, and that's simply not true. It's not science if you're not actually collecting data to test the theories. So I think that's where a lot of the objections come from. Look, to me, what science is if you have a phenomenon you want to explain, like why can people talk? The idea in science is you consider all possible explanations for that phenomenon. And for any explanation somebody brings up, you either should be able to say, okay, no, we know that explanation is wrong because we have this data that falsifies that explanation. Or you have to say, okay, yeah, no, we don't actually have any data that falsifies that right now, so it could be right. And then what you do is as different other explanations come in, you try and find a difference in the predictions that the two theories make, and then collect data to see which one makes the correct prediction. And so, because science involves considering all explanations, what that means is for any particular phenomenon, you need to consider, yes, all SSSM explanations for that phenomenon, but you also need to consider all evolutionary explanations for that phenomenon as well. You can't discount evolutionary explanations out of hand and not accord them the status of any other sort of explanation. No, all explanations have to be considered. And so then that includes evolutionary explanations. Okay? So yes, if somebody thinks that only evolutionary explanations can explain all phenomenon, that's wrong. But I've never met anybody like that, and I don't think there is anybody like that. All right, so that's what the objections I often hear and how I would respond to them. Like I said, I'd love to see in the comments, you might have additional objections as well to evolutionary psychology, and maybe we can discuss those in the comments of the tape. Okay, well, now we've come to near the end of the class, and now this is one of my favorite parts of the class. So I always end the class the same way. I always began the class by talking about the horrible fact that we're robots, that the genes have created to make copies of them. That's the implication from Hamilton's rule. And now I want to see how that plays out. Okay, I think when I give that lecture to the undergraduates, I think I told you I've occasionally have people crying at the break and come up and want to make sure, am I really serious that we're robots created to make copies of their genes? And I tell them, yeah, I am, but you need to wait till the end of the class, and we're going to revisit that. And so now that we talked about that, here's what I promised. We're going to revisit this. And so what I'm going to give you now is evolutionary philosophy of life. Okay? And I'm not saying that you have to adopt this philosophy as your own, but I don't think it will hurt you to hear this particular philosophy of life. And just for your own edification, you can say to other people, oh, yes, I know that evolutionary philosophy of life. And here's where it's got things wrong. Okay? But if I had 25 minutes to tell somebody something, what is the most important thing I could tell them in 25 minutes? And that would be what I'm about to tell you. So when I was in graduate school, I read The Selfish Gene for the first time. And before I had read it, I really didn't understand evolution. I thought evolution was, well, one animal turns into another, and that's how different species were created. But before I read The Selfish Gene and learned about Hamilton's rule, I didn't realize that the purpose of life and the reason why evolution occurs is because there was that original replicating molecule in the ocean that could make copies of itself. And that original molecule, over time, became more elaborate. It built a shell around itself to help it reproduce more and to protect itself from other replicators that are trying to use its genetic material to copy themselves. And that there's this long process of over 3 billion years by which more and more elaborate shells were created by these genes, ultimately culminating in the species that we see on Earth today, including humans. And so I realized that I was this robot built to pass along the genes. And Hamilton's rule tells me that what's more important than my life? What am I willing to give my life up for? Well, if I can make more copies of these genes. And it all seems so stupid and pointless to me. That's the purpose of my life, to be part of this 3 billion old process, making copies of these non-sentient things. I don't even know they're being copied, but that's why I'm here. That's what it's all about. And I felt like I was covered in filth for months afterwards, really. It really bothered me. But I resigned myself to it and, took the implications of that. The implications are, well, to be a successful person, if you want to be successful in your life, well, the most successful biological entity, the most successful dog, the most successful grass, and the most successful person is, in biological terms, the one who makes the most copies of their genes. If you think the purpose of your life is anything other than making copies of your genes, you're just fooling yourself. I was one of the people fooling myself, so I resign myself to that fact. The only actual objective measure for how successful your life is the number of genes that you copied. And so I resigned myself to the fact that, okay, I'm a robot who's made to copy these genes, and all right, I'll just embrace that. So how can I be successful, given that copying your genes is what makes you the most successful? So I went to look around and see, well, who are the most successful people right now, living right now? Who's copying the most genes? And it struck me it's, well, in America anyway, and maybe it's different in other countries, but in America it's probably the Amish. I mean, they don't use birth control, and they like to have lots and lots of kids, and so it's very common to have 10 to 12 kids, extremely common among the Amish. And what that means is, you maybe have well over 100 grandkids, very, very common among Amish people. Now, in the EEA, a replacement for a couple would be having 4 grandchildren, right? And so that would be, fairly successful. If you were able to get 6 grandchildren in the EEA, you really would have to be considered one of the most successful Homo sapiens who had more offspring than you'd predict. And so if I could have like 100 or 144 offspring, if I have 12 kids and they each have 12 kids, I could have 144 grandkids. Wow, that would really be successful. That would be probably, 0.001% of all humans in the number of offspring that I had. So I looked into joining the Amish, and it turns out it's not as hard as I thought it would be. What you have to do to join the Amish is you got to live with the Amish community for a year, but I was going to join them permanently, so I was definitely going to do that. And you're required to learn Pennsylvania Dutch, but if I was going to live with them, I'd learn Pennsylvania Dutch. So those are the two things I'd have to do anyway. And so after you've lived with them for a year and learned Pennsylvania Dutch, the community votes on whether to accept you as a member, and then if they do, then you're in and you're a fully Amish person and can start reproducing. So that was my first thought. But then, I don't know if you've heard that movie Delivery Man. It was by Vince Vaughn. It was about this guy who was a sperm donor. And it was actually based on a true story. There was this guy from Montreal who was like this super sperm donor. And I don't know if it was legal or illegal what he was doing, but had 250 kids through sperm donation. And, think of, well, if they each had 2 kids, that would be like 500 grandchildren that this guy would have if they, each of his kids averaged 2. And so, wow, that's way, way better than being an Amish person. I could actually, by being a sperm donor, make a lot more copies of my genes than I could as the Amish person. And so I thought, well, now what I should do is I should become the director of the sperm bank. And what I'll do when I become the director is I'll take, every waking hour of my life, every dime I had will be spent on trying to get around the security system at the sperm bank so I can deposit my own sperm in all the vials and things. And so even that guy from Montreal had 250 kids. I might have like thousands and thousands of kids this way, before I'm caught anyway. And that would make me like the greatest Homo sapien who's ever lived, because I would copy the most genes. Plato, Beethoven, Shakespeare, they're nothing compared to me, because the only objective measure of success is the number of genes that you copy, and that would allow me to copy the most genes. So that was my plan, was to become the director of a sperm bank. And at the time, if people would call me on the telephone and ask me, dude, what you doing? My kind of smart aleck answer would be, just trying to maximize my differential reproductive success, man. Same old, same old. Because I thought, yeah, that's what everything is directed towards. It's making copies of these genes. And so every minute of my life, I guess, even when I'm asleep, my life is devoted to making copies of these genes. So that's the only correct answer. So I had my life planned out. I was going to become the director of a sperm bank, and I didn't know quite what education you needed to become director of the sperm bank. I didn't know if maybe it's a business background or a medical background. Turns out they have these like health administrator, hospital administrator programs, and that is probably your best bet if you want to become director of a sperm bank, is to get a master's in health administration. And so that was my plan, was to go get a master's in health administration to try and become director of the sperm bank. But, I started looking over the classes I would have to take, and I'll admit, my thought was these look really horribly boring. And then I thought of living my life as the director of the sperm bank, and that sounds kind of a boring job. And I kept thinking, well, do I really want to spend every waking moment of the brief time I'm on Earth trying to get around the security system at a sperm bank? And do I really want to spend all my money on this? And let's say I were, in fact, successful. I did have like 1,000 kids or something. Would that really make me better than Beethoven? So I took a long look in the mirror one day, and I realized I was living my life for my genes. I was like a codependent. Well, I decided I'm not going to live my life for my genes anymore. I'm going to live my life for me. And you're thinking, well, wait a second now. Your genes are part of you, and you said that you are a robot who was built to copy these genes. And indeed, you went so far as to say anybody who thought that the purpose of their life was something other than copying their genes was just deluding yourself. So what do you mean living your life for your genes rather than living your life for you? Well, okay, let me try and explain what I mean maybe with an example here. This is an example mostly for the guys, but it will allow the females to see how well they understand male psychology. So, let's say, guys, you were presented with the following two scenarios. You can choose one or the other. So, one option is you can contribute some sperm to a sperm bank. So, take about half an hour. You will go in. They have a room. They have some magazines there you can look at. And you masturbate into a cup. And they guarantee, if you do this, that you will have two offspring from this encounter, two offspring that you will never meet and you will never have to support. So two offspring for half an hour's work that will probably go to adulthood and pass on their own genes. So that's one option. You can spend half an hour at the sperm bank. Second option, let's say an extremely attractive woman comes up to you and says, "Hi, I find you very attractive, and I would like to spend the next 24 hours being your personal pleasure provider. We will do anything you want for as long as you want." All right, but you haven't, it sounds good so far maybe, but you haven't heard the bad part yet. The bad part is that this woman is using several different forms of birth control, and so the odds that you're actually going to have any offspring as a result of this encounter are pretty much zero. So your options are spending half an hour at the sperm bank and get two offspring out of it, or spend 24 hours letting the extremely attractive woman being your personal pleasure provider but not get any offspring out of it. In fact, expend a lot of energy with no offspring as a result. Well, now, from your genes perspective, your genes have to be saying, "Oh, you got to do the sperm bank thing. Oh, that's so awesome. You get to have two kids that you don't have to support. For just half an hour of your time, you get to have two offspring." Most men work their whole lives just to support two offspring, and you get to do it for half an hour without expending any resources. You just hit the lottery. Go to the sperm bank. Go to the sperm bank. And yet, when I asked the undergraduate classes and I asked the guys to vote whether they want to go to the sperm bank or whether they want to have the personal pleasure provider for 24 hours, none of them vote for the sperm bank. And the reason is that when the genes designed us to want to pass them on, what they didn't do was give us the desire to make copies of our genes. That's why becoming the director of the sperm bank wasn't really that appealing to me, even though it's a very efficient way of producing your genes, reproducing your genes. What they did was they rewarded or designed us to reward the activities that would lead us to passing on our genes. And so what we really have been designed to care about is not the gene copying, but getting the rewards. And so if you get the rewards by actually reproducing, that's great. But if you want to get those rewards by not reproducing and maybe skip the whole reproduction process, that's okay too. So that's kind of what I was missing. Is I don't really care about the objective measure about the success of my life. Yes, if we had an anthropologist from another planet come down and view the creatures on Earth, and we ask, well, what are those creatures on Earth? What are they trying to do? Well, anthropologists from another planet would say, well, they're trying to copy their genes. That's what it's all about. And that's true. That's the objective measure, but I don't care about the objective measure. I care about the subjective measure. I want a life that gives me the rewards. I've been designed by evolution to care about the rewards, not to care about the gene copying. So yeah, I resigned myself. I'm a robot the genes built to make copies of them. But like, what kind of robot do I want to be? Do I want to be the robot that copied the most genes? The most obedient robot? Maybe the genes will make me employee of the month? Nah, I don't want to be the most obedient robot. I want to be the robot who figured out what was going on and then just spent the whole time he was here activating the reward centers of his brain as much as he possibly could. I want to be the happiest robot. And I don't really care whether that leads to any gene copying or not. I care about being happy. And that's the end. That's what your life is for. It's to get those rewards. The purpose of your life is to be happy. So, the nice thing about this is that using some evolutionary thinking, we can make some very good predictions about what should make us happy. So here's what I want you to try. I'm going to go through some of the things that, if you had a robot that you wanted to design to pass along its genes, what kinds of things would you want to reward? And I'm going to tell you some of those things. And when I tell you each of these things, I want you to imagine how you would feel if each of these things happened to you. And by that I mean, can you actually imagine the bodily sensations, what your body would experience, what it would feel if these things happened to you? Helps me to close my eyes to do that. But if you are good at imagining, by the time I am done, you will be a happier person. And surely you must have very bad genes if you would not enjoy that. So, if we were going to design a robot to pass along its genes, what kind of things would we want to reward? So how would you feel, imagine how you feel if these things happened to you? Having a cold drink when you're very thirsty. Eating something you've been craving when you're very hungry. Being someplace warm and safe and dry when it's storming outside. Seeing an increase in your status, like winning an award, or getting a raise at work, or graduating from graduate school. Spending time with an attractive member of the opposite sex. And falling in love. And getting married. And having sex. And seeing your first child born. And seeing your children grow and learn the things they're expected to learn and be accepted by other people. And seeing your children get married. And playing with your grandchildren. And if you wish to live a happy life, you'd attempt to have some of those experiences as part of it. So, if we wish to measure the success of someone's life, what's the appropriate metric for doing so? Who is the most successful person? Perhaps the most successful person is the wealthiest person. Maybe it's the wisest person, or the most intelligent person. Maybe it's the best-looking person. Maybe the appropriate metric to determine the success of your life is the number of people who love you. Or maybe it's the number of people who you love. But I would say it's none of the above. I would say the most successful person is the happiest person. There is only one way to live an unsuccessful life, and that is to live an unhappy one. So the genes designed us to be robots to make copies of them. But really, it's not such a bad deal when you think about it. You may well be done copying your genes by the time you're 35, but you get to live to be 80. And I think you should spend that time trying to grab as much happiness for yourself as you can. And now when somebody calls me on the phone and asks me, dude, what you doing? What I tell them is, just trying to maximize the activation level of my dopamine reward system, dude. Same old, same old. And that's the class.